The prison was a slab of concrete lost in the desert, its walls pitted and scorched from years of sandstorms and neglect. Each morning, the sun baked it dry, and each night the cold bit down like a predator gnawing bone. In the deep shadows of his cell, Ethan Cross counted the days on the wall with short, jagged lines. 8 years. 2,920 days since he'd been dragged in chains from a courtroom and thrown into this pit. They called him a monster. They said he was the butcher of Black Valley, the soldier who had led the massacre of civilians, women, children, old men. The trial had been fast, the verdict brutal, life without parole. His name was smeared across headlines, his face burned into the national memory, but the truth never made it into the papers. Ethan hadn't given the orders. He hadn't pulled the trigger. His unit had done that. 6 men he'd trusted with his life. They had planned it, executed it, and when the world demanded a scapegoat, they handed him over. In exchange for his silence, they walked free, promoted, decorated. Heroes. At first, Ethan's rage had burned so hot it threatened to devour him. He wanted revenge, but sitting in his cell, rotting day after day, he learned patience. He learned to listen. He learned how the guards rotated shifts, how supply trucks entered the back gate, how cameras could be blinded for precious seconds. And then one night, during a thunderstorm that turned the desert into a maze of mud and flickering lightning, Ethan disappeared. He slipped through a blind spot in the surveillance system, crawled through the storm drains, and vanished into the black. No one saw him again, until months later, when a live stream lit up the darkest corners of the internet. It wasn't slick, wasn't polished, just a grainy video feed showing a man bound to a chair in a dim basement. His name was Cole Brantley, a former sergeant, now a consultant for a military contractor. He was sweating, shaking, the fear plain in his eyes. Before him stood Ethan, leaner, harder, his eyes like chips of glass. His voice when he spoke was low and deliberate. "Tell them what you did." Cole stammered, begged, but Ethan only stood there, unmoving. "Confess, or I'll remind you." With a trembling voice, Cole confessed. He described the night in Black Valley, the orders to clear out the village, the systematic slaughter, the looting of homes, the burning of bodies. He described how they'd pinned it on Ethan to save themselves. The comments on the live stream exploded, thousands watching in horrified fascination. Ethan waited until the confession was complete, then stepped aside to reveal a shallow pit behind Cole. The floor was covered with ash and bone fragments, replicas of the fire pits used to burn the bodies in Black Valley. Ethan tied Cole to a post in the center, doused him with gasoline, and lit a match. The feed continued until the flames died, the last crackles of burning flesh fading into silence. The video went viral in the dark recesses of the web, tagged with Ethan's name and the words, "This is the truth they buried." The world recoiled. Some claimed it was fake. Others whispered that justice had finally found the men responsible. But Ethan didn't care about their chatter. He had more names on his list. Cole was just the beginning. He moved like a shadow through the country, using false identities, encrypted networks, safe houses provided by those who believed his story. He was no longer just a man. He was a ghost, a symbol of vengeance. Next was Andrew Clegg, the unit's sniper, now living comfortably in a lakeside home with his family. Ethan studied his routines, watched his house for weeks, until one night he struck. Andrew woke, tied to a chair in his own basement, his family locked safely away upstairs. "Tell them," Ethan said, holding the camera steady. Andrew tried to bargain, tried to lie, but the sight of Ethan's cold eyes broke him. He confessed everything, sobbing as he described how he had shot women carrying children, how he had laughed while doing it. Ethan forced him to kneel in the pit he'd prepared, a trench filled with muddy water and debris, mimicking the ditches they'd used for bodies. Andrew's execution was swift, a single shot to the back of the head, his body collapsing into the mud. The feed cut out, but not before Ethan spoke to the camera, his voice like ice. 2 down, 4 to go. The world will remember. As the news broke, the military and law enforcement launched a manhunt. Ethan's face appeared on every screen, branded as a dangerous fugitive. But every time they thought they had him cornered, he vanished, leaving only whispers and ashes behind. He had waited years in the dark, sharpening his mind, hardening his resolve. Now, with each confession, each execution, he was reclaiming his name, carving it into the fabric of history with blood and fire. And he was just getting started. The world tried to move on after the second livestream, but the images wouldn't fade. Ethan's face, cold, remorseless, haunted television screens and online feeds. Law enforcement agencies scoured his known haunts, interviewed anyone who had crossed paths with him. The military disavowed him, calling him a deranged war criminal. But some voices, quieter, began whispering that maybe he wasn't the villain the headlines claimed. Maybe he was the messenger of a truth too dark to confront. Ethan didn't care about public opinion. He had one purpose left: finish the list. The next name was Vincent Moore. Vincent had been the unit's intelligence officer, the one who had identified the insurgents in Black Valley, marking targets that were nothing more than frightened civilians. Now he sat comfortably as a security consultant for a private defense contractor, living behind guarded gates and surveillance cameras. Ethan spent weeks studying the patterns of the estate. The guards were professional but predictable. Ethan slipped through shadows, bypassing alarms and cameras with ease. He struck when Vincent was alone in his private gym, the heavy thump of his music covering the sudden burst of violence as Ethan took him down, binding his hands and gagging him before he knew what hit him. When Vincent woke, he found himself in a recreation of his own interrogation room from years ago. A single light bulb swung overhead. Ethan's face was illuminated in the dim glow as he set up the camera. "Tell them," Ethan said, his voice hollow. "Tell them what you did." Vincent tried to hold out, but Ethan knew the right buttons to push. He described the way Vincent had fabricated intelligence reports, claiming Black Valley was harboring insurgents when it was nothing but families. He described how Vincent had coordinated the operation, then falsified reports after the massacre to clear the unit's name and pile the blame onto Ethan. Ethan forced him to read the reports aloud, page by page, as the camera captured every word. Then he dragged Vincent to a pit he'd prepared behind the gym, a pit lined with broken glass, reflecting the shards of the shattered lives from Black Valley. Ethan tied him in place, set the camera to record, and methodically bled him out, one vein at a time, until Vincent's lifeless body sagged into the glass. The livestream ended with a message in blood scrawled across the floor: 3 down, 3 to go. The country reeled. Media outlets debated the validity of the confessions. Law enforcement doubled the manhunt, sweeping through old military networks, pressuring former contacts. But no one could find Ethan. He had become a phantom, slipping through the cracks, always one step ahead. Next was Thomas Ward, the communications specialist, the man who had jammed distress signals from Black Valley and doctored after-action reports. Ethan found him living under a new name in a mountain cabin, isolated but comfortable. He broke in under cover of night, overpowering Ward in his sleep. Ward awoke bound to a steel chair, his surroundings eerily silent except for the soft hum of static from an old radio. Ethan stood over him, the camera rolling, forcing him to confess every action. The jamming, the false logs, the destruction of evidence. "You thought hiding would save you," Ethan said softly, "but there's nowhere you can go where the truth won't find you." He wired Ward into the old radio equipment, sending distorted screams through the frequencies. The execution was brutal, electrocution until his body convulsed and sagged. The final transmission was a garbled confession, broadcast across amateur radio bands, ensuring it would be heard far and wide. 4 down, Ethan whispered to the camera. 2 to go. With each act, the noose tightened around him. The military intensified their search, deploying special units. The media branded him a domestic terrorist. Bounties were offered, tips flooded in. But Ethan knew how to move, how to vanish. He had lived in shadows for years. They were his second skin. He prepared for the next target, Eric Vaughn, the unit's medic. The man who had withheld care from the wounded, ensuring no survivors from the massacre would be able to testify. Eric now worked as a paramedic in a quiet suburban town, lauded for his heroism on the job. Ethan spent days tracking him, waiting for the right moment. He struck in the dead of night, intercepting Eric during a routine call. When Eric woke, he was in a mock field hospital Ethan had constructed in an abandoned warehouse, complete with blood-stained sheets and medical equipment salvaged from discarded supplies. "Tell them," Ethan said, his voice as cold as the steel table Eric was strapped to. Eric's confession poured out, tears mingling with snot and blood. He admitted to letting children die without care, smothering wounded civilians to silence their cries, all to cover the unit's tracks. Ethan forced him to perform mock surgeries on himself, cutting into his own flesh under threat until he collapsed from blood loss and shock. The livestream ended with a stark message: 5 down, 1 to go. Ethan's final target was the man who had orchestrated it all, the commanding officer, Colonel Richard Kane, the man who had ordered the massacre, sealed the cover-up, and handed Ethan over as the scapegoat. A man now retired, living comfortably with accolades and a quiet life. But Ethan was coming for him. Ethan spent weeks preparing for the final act. He knew Colonel Richard Kane wouldn't be as easy to reach as the others. Kane had retired into a life of opulence, guarded by private security in a gated mansion, his name whispered with respect in military circles. His war crimes were hidden beneath layers of honors and connections. But Ethan was patient. He observed the security routines, learned the shifts, watched for gaps. He blended into the shadows outside the estate, waiting for the right night. The night when Kane's guards rotated and the cameras lagged during system updates. When the time came, Ethan moved with practiced ease. He bypassed motion detectors, disabled cameras, and slipped inside through a servant's entrance. He knew the house's layout, having obtained blueprints from a sympathetic source. Kane was in his study, sipping bourbon, the glow of a fire casting long shadows across the walls. Ethan emerged from the darkness, his presence sudden and silent. Kane turned, shock flickering across his face before he reached for a concealed pistol. Ethan was faster, disarming him with a brutal twist that snapped his wrist. The gun clattered to the floor. "You?" Kane gasped, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "Yes," Ethan said, his voice calm. "Me, the man you sacrificed for your medals?" Kane's face twisted with contempt. "You're a traitor. You always were. I cleaned up your mess. You should be thanking me." Ethan struck him across the face, sending him sprawling to the floor. He bound Kane's wrists with zip ties, dragged him into a hidden passage Ethan had discovered in his research, and brought him to a soundproofed wine cellar beneath the mansion. There he set up the camera, just as he had for the others. He forced Kane into a chair, the cold concrete biting into the old man's skin. "Tell them," Ethan said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Kane sneered. "You'll never get away with this. The world believes me. They'll call you a madman, a killer. Then tell the truth, prove me wrong." For the first time, Ethan saw the cracks in Kane's mask. The old man's bravado faltered, his shoulders sagging. He realized there was no bargaining, no escape. Kane's confession came haltingly, at first defiant, then breaking into something raw. He spoke of the orders he'd given, the directive to eliminate every living thing in Black Valley, to burn the bodies, to fabricate the insurgency narrative. He spoke of how he'd used Ethan as the scapegoat, spinning a story of a rogue soldier to protect the unit's reputation and his own career. Ethan listened in silence, recording every word. When the confession ended, Kane slumped in the chair, breathing heavily. "You've had your revenge," he rasped. "What now? You'll kill me, make a martyr of me?" Ethan's eyes were like ice, not a martyr, a memory, a lesson. He forced Kane to kneel in the center of the cellar, binding him to a post. Around them, Ethan had recreated the scene of Black Valley, the charred remains of makeshift huts, the scattered bones, the burned clothing he had collected from the victims' families. It was a silent, haunting reconstruction of the massacre. Ethan set the camera to capture everything. He poured accelerant around the room, its fumes thick and acrid. Kane's eyes widened with terror as realization dawned. "You're insane," Kane gasped. "This won't change anything. They'll just cover it up again, they'll bury it." Ethan's voice was low, steady. "No. This time, the world will see. This time, they'll remember." He struck the match and dropped it. The flames leapt up, hungrily devouring the accelerant, racing across the floor. Kane's screams echoed in the confined space, mingling with the crackling of fire. The camera caught it all. The confession, the execution, the rising inferno. Ethan stood in the shadows, watching as the flames consumed the last of Kane's legacy. When it was over, he retrieved the camera, slipping away into the night as the mansion collapsed into smoldering ruin. The final live stream cut across the internet like a blade. It showed everything: Kane's confession, his execution, the silent witnesses of the reconstructed Black Valley. The world couldn't look away. News outlets tried to bury it, calling Ethan a terrorist, a madman. But the footage spread like wildfire, shared across networks, dissected by journalists, discussed in forums. Whispers grew louder. Whispers of a hidden massacre, of the price of silence, of justice delivered by the very man they had condemned. Ethan knew he was now the most wanted man in the country, perhaps the world. But he didn't care. He had done what he set out to do. The world would remember, and his name would not be forgotten. The final video of Richard Kane's confession and execution tore through the fabric of public silence like a grenade. No longer confined to whispers in dark corners of the web, it was now impossible to ignore. News networks spun frantic narratives, politicians scrambled to denounce Ethan as a terrorist, while human rights organizations demanded formal inquiries into the events at Black Valley. But Ethan had vanished. In the weeks after the final stream, law enforcement agencies launched coordinated manhunts across cities, wilderness, and beyond. They interrogated his old cellmates, former military contacts, even his estranged family. None could give a location. The media dubbed him the Ghost of Black Valley, a specter of vengeance who had slipped through their grasp. But Ethan didn't care about the headlines. He was done with confessions, done with executions. The final name on his list, his own, awaited. He drove through back roads and desolate highways, eventually reaching the borderlands of a remote desert. Here, beneath the sky washed in bruised twilight, he parked the stolen vehicle and stepped into the open. His hands were scarred from years of violence, his eyes hollow from what he had seen and done. But his back was straight, his movements sure. He carried with him a single small device, a portable transmitter linked to encrypted channels. On it was stored every confession, every gruesome act, every piece of footage from his campaign. The data was timed to upload to every major network and underground server, ensuring it would be broadcast globally. The world could no longer deny the truth. Ethan stood in the middle of the desert, surrounded by silence, and activated the upload. As the files began transmitting, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't looking for forgiveness. He wasn't seeking redemption. He was simply ensuring that no one could erase what had been done. The truth would be a scar across history, a reminder that silence breeds monsters. He watched the progress bar fill, the blinking light confirming successful transmission. The entire world now held the truth, the confessions, the crimes, the executions, indelible, unalterable. He sat on the sand, leaning back against a boulder, and for the first time in years, he felt a quiet stillness settle around him. He had no illusions about his fate. He had painted a target on his back that no one would forgive or forget, but he had done what needed to be done. As the desert cooled and the first stars appeared, he closed his eyes. His last thoughts were not of war, or death, or even revenge. They were of the civilians of Black Valley. Faces he could no longer see clearly, but whose cries had echoed in his nightmares for nearly a decade. "I did what you couldn't," he murmured, voice barely audible in the gathering dark. "They'll remember you now. They'll remember everything." A soft breeze stirred the sand, whispering across the ground like the ghost of a confession. Ethan remained still, his breathing slowing, his pulse steady. He didn't run when the searchlights crested the distant ridge. He didn't flinch at the sound of helicopters in the distance. He had faced death 1,000 times before. This time it would come, not as an enemy, but as a release. By the time the search teams arrived, all they found was the silent transmitter, still warm, still blinking. Ethan Cross was gone. But the world would remember, and his story, carved in blood and confession, would never be forgotten.